Hi, I'm David Burns, Chairman of the English Business Council. I'm delighted to welcome today Jan Bladen, who is the Managing Partner of Governance Creed. Jan, tell us all about governance.
David, good morning. How are you?
Good, mate. Good.
Look, it's been quite challenging over the last few weeks, as many of us will know. I think we're suffering from a dual black swan event, especially with regards to the exposure in the Middle East. One is obviously, as we're all aware, the potential impacts of COVID-19 on the economic situation across the GCC region. And I think that's probably where most of us are focused at this present moment in time, because that's where most of us have been impacted in terms of our families, in terms of potential lockdowns and others. So I think many of us have become experts in terms of using Zoom. That may not be the largest black swan. The larger black swan actually might be the challenges and the issues that we've had with oil prices across the region, specifically some of the historical limits that we've set over the last couple of weeks in terms of oil price. And as many of us will know, whilst there are numerous countries across the GCC making gigantic efforts to try and diversify their economies away from the dependence on the price of oil, we are still, nevertheless, at this present moment in time and for the foreseeable future, highly dependent on our revenues generated by the sale of oil. So when we look up and down the GCC and we see oil prices dropping below $10 a barrel, and obviously everybody knows about it having dropped to a negative situation, that is going to have a severe impact in terms of our GDP growth, in terms of our government spending, and in terms of the knock-on effects to our sectors across the Middle East. Jumping to the conclusion, rather than wanting to become an economist and analyze all the impacts and others, I firmly believe that with the oil collapse and the fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, we're going to see more and more companies and governments across the region looking to either reschedule debts, looking to either sell assets, or looking to raise financing, all the elements required to try and plug our financing gap and to strengthen the balance sheets of our corporations at this present moment in time. Taking that as a base, if I jump to the historical studies, numerous international studies, including things from the International Finance Corporation, which is a member of the World Bank Group, and others, there has been a long-term historical basis and belief that well-governed corporations perform better, and that adopting world standard or best practices of corporate governance on a global basis has several advantages to corporations that do it. The first advantage is that very simply it will improve your access to external financing. Second one being that as it does that, it will actually lower your cost of capital, or your weighted average cost of capital, simply because you will pay less for your debt because your trust in the international markets is a lot higher. It will lead to improvements in your operational performances. As your internal controls improve, your internal operations will improve. And the more trust you build, the longer the firm's long-term valuation will be in terms of the international investors in the marketplace. So as you improve that trust, as you improve that long-term valuation, you actually start to reduce the risks of corporate scandals. And I'll cover that in a second. And what we find long-term is that there is a very strong positive correlation between well-governed companies and corporations and investors willing to pay a significant premium to be able to invest in those organizations because of the infrastructure of controls, because of trusts and others. Now, David, I'm sure you're going to ask me, well, doesn't that have a cost? And yes, it does have a cost. The costs of good governance will include having an independent board of directors with the right skill set mix that understand the industry, that understand the legal implications. When you put together a board of directors, you're not just looking for the financial skill sets, the strategy skill sets, the legal skill sets, but you'll be looking for the market understanding, the cultural understanding, and others as well. And that doesn't come for free. Very much you get what you pay for in terms of your non-executive independent directors on a board. You'll need the right governance structures in place with the right board committees and the right amount of transparency to the international markets as well, which requires you to have your annual and quarterly reporting, your monthly touch points with the international investor community and others. If you're a group in the Middle East, you're going to need a chief governance officer. That is something that, in my experience over the last few years, has been significantly lacking in terms of groups, is a very structured strategy setting, business setting, reporting structure in large groups and large entities. You'll need board secretaries. You'll need a recognized external auditor to try and provide you with that third-party reassurance, risk management, internal audit. You'll need some sort of governance policies and procedures in terms of budgeting, strategy, control, infrastructure. And you'll need a delegation of authority, a RACIS matrix, risk appetites, and others. So to be able to gain the benefits that we just highlighted a few minutes ago, there is a spend and there is a cost side to it as well. Now, we've both been in the Middle East for, I don't know how long you've been in the Middle East for, David, now 25 years, 30 years? I spent 25 years of my life in the Middle East. So I think between the two of us, we've probably got 60 odd years of Middle Eastern experience. I'm married to an Arab. I didn't marry the lady, I married the tribe, I married the culture, I married the region. For us to want to implement good corporate governance, it's going to mean two things. It's going to mean we're going to need to spend when we haven't necessarily got the available cash that we want to be able to invest in it. And it might mean that we have to indirectly admit that we weren't doing it in the first place, which is definitely something that would not fit with the culture in the Middle East. But I think we've passed the stage of it becoming optional now. We may have beaten around the bush over the last few years. We may have paid a certain amount of what somebody might call lip service to it. I definitely wouldn't suggest that, but people might have made the right noises without actually having done the real work behind the scenes. I think the time's probably come now when you do a cost-benefit analysis between the benefits of good governance and the costs of good governance. It's going to make a very big difference to you being able to attract those international investors, to those firms being able to raise either capital contribution or to some of those groups being able to sell certain of their entities into the international marketplace. If we choose...
Just to interrupt a second, you're probably the most qualified and the most knowledgeable person I know in the Middle East in terms of board direction, corporate governance, etc. Can you just give us a very brief outline as to where you started, what you've done, and where you are now?
Of course. Look, I was very lucky that I was raised across the Middle East as a child. So I started back in 1972 in Abu Dhabi with my parents. My parents were in the oil industry, and I was raised across the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. I think I've spent 25 or 26 years of my life in the Middle East now, between Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Jeddah, Bahrain, Algeria, Tunisia. I'm now married to an Arab. My kids speak fluent Arabic, and they actually, on a humorous side, they flick between Lebanese Arabic on one side and Khaliji Arabic with their Emirati friends on another side. So it's very much a question of understanding the culture, but also understanding that at the end of the day, we've really got to get good governance in place. If we don't, we'll start to find that boards and senior management will over time fail to set strategy properly and fail to manage risks properly. We'll start to see over time that we end up with poor disclosure. We'll end up with lack of transparency becoming common, and we'll end up with shareholder rights starting to be mistreated, especially minority shareholders. We'll end up with too much power being centered on one individual or on a group of individuals, and we'll end up with a group of senior individuals in management without the appropriate oversight. And if we get to the stage of the board failing to ensure that we've got robust controls and oversight, we're going to end up with breaking news. And what I mean by breaking news, if I go to the West, I'm talking about historically Enron, WorldCom, more recently Lehman Brothers, and even more recently, Bernie Madoff and the situation there. Unfortunately, the Middle East is not immune to what's happened in the West first. We're going to have more of the Mohammed al-Mujahideen groups in Saudi Arabia. We'll have exactly the Abraj groups, which was made up of the components I just mentioned: too much power, not enough oversight, not enough control by boards. Mobili, in terms of their financial accounting in Saudi Arabia. Some of the challenging issues that we've currently got with Drake and Skull. And then more recently, literally in the last few weeks, is NNC. So we're starting to, unfortunately, see an exasperation of the lack of our investment in terms of good governance in the Middle East being accelerated by the economic downturn. And the only analogy I can really give is, as the economic tide in the Middle East is pulling out, that's when we see the amount of elements or lacking of elements that are left on the economic beaches across the Middle East. We're going to need to pedal hard in terms of providing the international reassurance, and we're actually going to have to get to the stage of implementing some good governance structures, albeit within the cultural elements. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. It's difficult in the region to come up with truly independent directors. Why? Because our society in the Middle East is so interlinked. We're tribal. So it's very, very difficult to really come up and find an independent director that fits the skill sets that you need on your board, that is not conflicted in one way or another. So we can take the good rules of corporate governance from other parts of the region and other parts of the world and adapt them. So there is nothing in the West that unfortunately stops us from having an independent director. Let me put it another way. If we take the rule of independence from the West and slightly adapt it for the Middle East, what we could do is find directors to fit our boardroom skill set mixes, but ensure that they're not involved in decisions where they're conflicted. So we could come up with certain adapted corporate governance rules and regulations. If we look up and down the GCC over the last few years, you'll find that many of the governments, many of the regulatory authorities of which I was involved with building the DFSA as one of them, have come up with corporate governance rules, laws, and regulations. And I firmly now believe we need to migrate from developing rules, laws, and regulations to actually implementing them effectively and truly inside our larger organizations.
Weren't you part of the development? Did you not start at DFSA and saw it through from when it first began? You put in all the rules and carried on, and then I think you went to ADGM. Was that the path?
Look, I was very lucky. I was recruited by Dubai government. I became the founding chief operating officer of the Dubai Financial Services Authority for, I think, just under 9 years. Following that, I had the pleasure of working for Ahmed Al Sayed in Abu Dhabi when we launched Abu Dhabi Global Markets. So yes, I've had the pleasure of being involved in both of the UAE's financial centers. I think both of us have had the pleasure of seeing the upcycle and the growth that we've experienced across not only the UAE but the region. And I firmly believe that one of the key pillars to ensuring that we can contribute to the growth of the region across the next 10, 15, and 20 years is making sure that we get the right governance in place.
Absolutely.
What we used to do in the old days for the last 20, 25, 30 years was appropriate. If we don't adapt, that won't get us through the next 5 years.
Do you think, briefly, that the world and the countries that are putting so much into this effort to shore up economies and things, do you not think that the world is now bankrupt and that there's going to come a point in the future where that has to be adjusted across the board?
David, I'm not an economist. I'm very much a pragmatic, hands-on board member, independent board member. I know some of the boards that I've been serving on, and I've got a board meeting this afternoon. We regularly get updates in terms of economists that do give us the overview. Some of the overviews I've had over the last couple of weeks are challenging in terms of requirements in the region over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I know that you have a board meeting to go to. Thank you so much for joining me today.
David, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Cheerio.
Cheers now.